At 2:47 a.m., my phone carved a white scar across the living room. A photo blinked in from Vegas. My wife, Grace, beaming under a pink chapel sign, her fingers laced with my best friend, Thomas Peter. The text after it read, "Just married Peter, you're pathetic." I typed one word back, "Cool, no storm, no speeches." I opened my laptop and started shutting valves, removed her as an authorized user, froze the backup card, swept our joint balance into a separate high-yield account, left $15,840 for auto-drafted utilities, and suspended her line on our cell plan. Digital oxygen, cut. By 4:10 a.m., a locksmith was drilling out the deadbolts. At 5 o'clock, fresh brass clicked. I stacked her things in labeled boxes by the door. By sunrise, what used to be a marriage had boundary lines. Then came the pounding, hard, official, relentless. I checked the peephole, uniforms, cruiser, clipped voices on the radio. Peter and Grace wanted back in. I didn't have a breakdown waiting for them. I had documents and a photo, and one advantage they hadn't considered. I sat there on the couch, listening to the old wall clock keep time like it was being paid by the second. 15 steady years didn't feel steady anymore. They felt like receipts I'd kept but never read. The TV glow washed the room in late-night blue. I stood not because I was brave, but because sitting suddenly felt like surrender. I clicked on my office lamp, the kind with a steady white circle that makes paper look honest. I don't Peter speeches when life hits. I Peter checklists. Somewhere in another city, people were clapping under pink neon and bad decisions. Here, it was just me, a keyboard, and a backbone I almost forgot I had. I pulled a legal pad closer, drew a box, and wrote a single word, perimeter. Step 1, I told myself, close the gaps. Step 2, keep breathing. I wasn't going to perform grief for anyone. I was going to run an operation with my name on it. I logged into the bank like a firefighter entering smoke, one careful move at a time. Our joint account greeted me with a bland balance that suddenly looked like a trapdoor. Grace Martin sat on the authorized users list, comfortable as a lawn chair on Sunday. I removed her, then I froze the backup cards, the ones we swore we only kept for travel. I swept the joint funds into my what-if fund, the one I built the year we missed a tax deadline, and I promised myself that would never happen again. I left enough money to keep the lights on and the heat running. Nothing you could throw a party with, just utilities on autopilot. The small act felt big, like cutting a rope with someone still tugging on the other end. I wasn't trying to starve anyone. I was closing a valve before the whole house flooded. When the transfer confirmation blinked green, my hand stopped shaking. The system was responding to its owner. Next came the cell plan, the overlooked backbone of modern life. I opened the dashboard, clicked through the layers of polite menus, and reported her line stolen. It wasn't spite, it was containment. If you've ever cleaned up a burst pipe, you know you don't mop first. You shut the main. The moment I hit submit, Vegas went quiet in my pocket. No blue bubbles, no location pings, no roaming charges dressed up as romance. I stared at the family photo still used as the account avatar. Vacation smiles, matching sunglasses, the kind of picture that tricks you into thinking time can't turn. Control in our marriage had lived in data. Who paid what? Who carried which password? Who noticed charges at 2:13 a.m.? I had been the steward of that quiet King Peterm for years. Tonight, the job description changed. Tonight, I wasn't just keeping the house running. I was keeping the house from being run through. The silence on my phone felt earned. By 4 in the morning, I was patterned with screens and ready for hardware. I called a locksmith whose ad promised 24/7. He sounded like he'd just swallowed gravel and coffee. I respected the combination. 25 minutes later, headlights slid across the living room. We didn't make small talk. He measured, removed, and replaced. Old brass dropped into a canvas bag with a soft clatter that felt ceremonial. Fresh cylinders clicked into place like sentences finely punctuated. I signed the receipt, paid in cash, and watched him drive away into the gray. That first turn of the new deadbolt felt like a handshake with myself. Firm, overdue. I stood in the entryway and realized something important had shifted. The door didn't just divide outside from inside anymore. It divided a past I couldn't fix from a future I could control. I locked it once more, not out of fear, but to hear the sound. It didn't say stay out. It said I choose who comes in. I walked the house with a cardboard roll resolve, folding and taping like I'd done this in another life. I hadn't. but you can learn anything when you have to. Dresses, heels, makeup bags, 2 designer totes with the tissue still inside, and the so-called collectibles she told me were investments. Each item had a story I used to let pass me by. Tonight, the stories lined up for exit. I labeled every box. Grace. 1 hour pickup. It wasn't a punishment. It was a policy. I placed the boxes in a neat stack near the door, a tidy mountain of no and never again. I stood back and exhaled. People think closure arrives with speeches and tears. Sometimes closure arrives in Sharpie. I made a quick inventory on my phone for the lawyer. Contents, date, time. I took photos not to post, but to remember I did this right. When I put the marker down, my hand smelled like a fresh start. The pounding sounded like someone trying to knock old decisions out of a wall. I checked the peephole and found 2 uniforms and a cruiser idling behind them. I opened the door on the chain. "Mr. Cole?" the older one asked, voice sanded smooth by years of nights like this. "Your wife says you've locked her out and cut off access to funds." The word wife landed heavy, like a memory pretending to be a fact. I held up my phone. Chapel photo, text message, timestamp. "She's not my wife," I said, not loud, not proud, just patern. They looked. The younger one bit down, a reaction he'd probably had to stifle before. The older one breathed out through his nose, a sound like a verdict softening. For a heartbeat, I wondered if they would ask me to unpeter what I'd patern. Instead, they asked for my ID. I handed it over and waited for the next shoe to fall. It didn't. The radio on the older officer's shoulder crackled, and he spoke into it with the slow confidence of someone used to rooms that want too much. "Civil matter," he said. "Sole property of Mr. Cole. Possible bigamy in Nevada." On some distant speakerphone, Grace erupted, a string of words that used to scare me into compliance. The chain stayed on. My pulse didn't jump. The younger officer gave a professional, nearly invisible nod, the kind you offer a man who just took his hands off a steering wheel and let the car coast to safe shoulder. "You may get calls from attorneys," the older one added, handing back my license. "Respond through counsel." "That's the plan," I said. They stepped away, boots thudding down the porch. For the first time in a long time, the door felt like it worked for me. The peephole went dark as they left, and I realized the house was quiet enough to hear my own yes. After they drove off, I made tea the way my grandfather taught me. Boil rolling, leaves in the pot, give it time. I stood at the window while the maple in the front yard wore its October fire. The leaves didn't apologize for changing. They just changed. I took a sip and felt heat settle my chest. I could still love steadiness without letting it chain me to harm. Then I dialed Margaret Hill, the attorney I'd saved in my contacts under if the worst. And she answered on the second ring, refreshed by a kind of practiced outrage. I told her about the photo, the time, the locks. "Good," she said, not because the situation was good, but because I wasn't improvising feelings. "We'll need documentation, everything." As we hung up, a clean list formed in my head. Gather, sort, label, store. The same skills that run servers and networks can run a life. The tea went warm. The plan went hot. When I said the word bigamy, Margaret let out a dry, surgical chuckle. "Some clients bring me a mess," she said. "You brought me a file." I forwarded screenshots, transaction logs, the locksmith invoice, and a photo inventory of the boxed items. She told me 3 rules. Don't engage online. Don't respond to bait. Don't break the chain of custody. I wrote them down as if they were commandments and underlined the line about speaking only through counsel. Control isn't about volume. It's about sequence. "Expect noise," she said just before we ended the call. Noise arrived like a parade you didn't invite. It came with hashtags and confident strangers. The difference now was simple. I had a calendar. They had a chorus. I set a reminder for tomorrow to print everything with timestamps. People trust paper more than pixels. I saved the files twice. Disaster taught me to keep duplicates. Betrayal taught me why. Rumors always travel faster than facts because they don't carry luggage. By lunchtime, Jake Walters, the friend who loves a spotlight the way cats love sun, posted that I had financially suffocated Grace. Those words had a click-friendly rhythm to them. The likes bloomed. The comments rehearsed. Neutral acquaintances picked a side in 4 taps or less. I stared at the screen until I felt that old, familiar urge to explain myself, to stand on digital furniture and shout the truth. I put the phone down. I washed a mug. I took a breath. If you're over 30, you learn that life is not a debate club. It's a record. Your job is to keep one. I opened a new folder on my desktop labeled Public Claims, and I took screenshots of every post, every tag, every claim said with a smirk. My heart tried to sprint. I told it to walk. When facts are your ally, pace becomes a weapon. I chose slow. Early afternoon, my doorbell rang with the impatience of people who think manners are for other folks. Eleanor, my mother, stood there with Grace and Peter as if they'd been cast for a show called Make It All Go Away. "Stop the theatrics," my mother said. "Open the door. Talk like adults." I looked at Grace first, then at Peter. He couldn't hold my eyes long. It's hard to look into a mirror when you're still trying to be a window. I kept the chain on. "This is my home," I said evenly. "This conversation happens through lawyers." My mother shifted, torn between the son she raised and the story she preferred. Grace lifted her chin. Peter checked his phone. The scene wanted to turn me into a villain who wouldn't negotiate. I changed the script. "You have 1 hour to pick up your boxes," I told Grace. "After that, they're gone." The clock, for once, was on my side. I turned then to Peter, the man I'd trusted with spare keys and unflattering stories. "HR hates scandals," I said, voice calm enough to carry. "One email with a photo, and you'll both be explaining yourself for a living." It wasn't a threat. It was market research. Corporate America forgives almost anything except the kind of attention that scares advertisers. He finally looked up, and in that brief meeting of eyes, you can measure the distance between who you thought someone was and who they are under pressure. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. Grace threw a look at my mother that said, "Control him." My mother tried. "Please," she said, the words stretched thin. "Don't make this worse." "I'm making it accurate," I replied. The chain stayed on. The clock kept moving. I gave them space to Peter what they came to Peter. Move boxes, not boundaries. The door clicked shut, and I let my shoulders drop an inch. Through the peephole, I watched the choreography of consequences. Grace swiped a card. Declined. She tried another. Declined again. Peter whispered something meant to be soothing, and failed. My mother stood off to the side, phone to her ear, jaw tight with logistics. A minute later, I heard her read her credit card number to a clerk, the syllables of each digit like pebbles thrown into a pond. Shame reddened faces outside and cooled the room inside. I didn't celebrate. I noted. People who don't respect lines only learn from boundaries that hold. Behind my new locks, I counted 10 breaths and then 10 more until my heart matched the rhythm. The stack of boxes shrank one by one. When the last one left the foyer, I took a photo of the empty space. It looked like a new hallway, even though nothing had changed except everything. If pain teaches you anything, it's to document when doors close. I called Roger Patel, the friend I met freshman year when our DOM Wi-Fi crashed, and we fixed it before the RA knew. He listened without interrupting, then said, "Don't argue. Download your full Facebook archive. People who think they're clever always leave breadcrumbs." I followed his steps. Account settings, request copy, select messages and media, include metadata. While the export queued, he reminded me to verify system time on my laptop. If they attack the timeline, we win with timestamps, he said. I wrote that down like a recipe. On the kitchen counter, a half-eaten granola bar looked like something from a different chapter. When hunger meant breakfast instead of proof. The archive email arrived. I pulled the zip file down, extracted it to a new folder, and let years spill into nested directories. "You're not chasing drama," Roger said before we hung up. "You're preserving evidence." That word sat in my chest like weight and like relief. The messages read like a play where I was the punchline and the only one who didn't get the joke. They called me the warden. Funny until you realize it's a mask for resentment. They compared my birthday gifts to clearance bin fines. They coached each other on how to write row series in memo lines to siphon cash unnoticed. I lined their words up against bank statements and watched numbers echo jokes. 18 months. Over 10,000 Peterlers. Betrayal. Itemized and reconciled. I didn't rage. I made a spreadsheet with tabs. Messages, transactions, cross-refs. I highlighted entries in 2 colors. Assumption and proof. The red column grew. The blue column locked it down. By the time I finished, I wasn't wounded so much as awake. There's a unique quiet that comes when the smoke clears and the room you're standing in is the truth. I saved the file twice and printed copies. Paper doesn't refresh. It remembers. I didn't draft a manifesto for the internet. I built an album called The Truth and let their sentences hang themselves. Screenshots with full headers, statements with dates, side-by-sides that made denial look silly. I posted it public and stepped away from the screen. Somewhere, people would argue about tone and timing and whether I should have kept this private. But privacy had already been traded for chapel lights and captions. I wasn't trying to trend. I was putting a stake in the ground where stories go to warp. 10 minutes later, my phone began to buzz like a jar of hornets. Texts, DMs, voicemails, even a couple of emails from old friends who discovered empathy once the receipts landed. I turned the phone face down. Whatever this was going to become, it would peter so without me sitting there measuring every ripple. I'd already measured what mattered. The record was set. The rest was weather. My device kept vibrating across the table, a small machine doing a big job, delivering everyone else's feelings to a house I finally owned again. Apologies came in clumsy and late. Accusations arrived polished and sure. Most people chose silence, which is a kind of confession if you listen closely. I opened Peter Not Disturb and let the room breathe. In the quiet, I could hear the refrigerator hum and the heating kick on. Small Peter-mestic noises that sound like stability if you've ever lived without it. I made a sandwich I barely tasted and sat with the kind of tired that doesn't ask for a nap. When grief tries to sprint, wisdom walks. I took out a notebook and listed everything still ahead. Attorney meetings, HR fallout, potential restraining orders, court dates. The list didn't scare me. It sorted me. By the time I capped the pen, my pulse had steadied. Noise outside, order inside. That's a win. In the late afternoon, Mr. Henderson called from a number I had saved under Boss Good One. He sounded like a man who'd seen a lot and still believed in paperwork. Peter's father rang me up. He said, "Tried to paint you unstable." I pictured the conversation. Polished voice, veiled threats, name-dropping like confetti. Henderson chuckled. "Not my first rodeo. Take a few paid days. Legal's looped in if you need them." That small vote of confidence felt bigger than a speech. Work doesn't fix your life, but it gives it shape when life bends. I thanked him and added a calendar note to send him a summary after filings. Then I screenshotted the call log and saved it with the others. The more they tried to tilt the floor under me, the more I trusted flat surfaces. When we hung up, I looked around the room that had become a staging area and an island. The house didn't echo. It answered. Night found me in a chair by the window, hands wrapped around a mug, the maple tree throwing shadows that looked like handwriting. I thought about the house I bought before vows, the summers we repainted the porch, the winters we learned which windows whistled first. Peace isn't a personality trait, it's maintenance. I had kept things running, the bills, the passwords, the appointments, like a man tending a lighthouse everyone liked to visit and no one remembered to fuel. Love made that feel noble. Betrayal made it feel naive. I won't lie, there's a version of me that wanted to shout and break something and demand a jury of friends. But the person who stood up tonight chose a different legacy. Protect what's yours. Protect who you are. When my phone finally stilled and the house settled, I felt a thin thread of pride where panic used to be. If love is a promise, then protection is the promise you keep to yourself. The next morning, my phone rang with that syrupy tone people use when they want to steer you. Peter Loris, Grace's mother, opened with a hymn. Marriage is forgiveness. I've heard older folks say the same line at church potlucks. Good line, wrong day. I pictured her dining room, the crystal bowl nobody touches, and the plastic runner on the carpet. Everything protected, but nothing honest. Peter Loris, I said, calm as a porch swing. Thank you for the clarity. Then I ended the call. I learned from my father that not every conversation deserves a chair. The older you get, the more you understand the cost of staying on the line. I set the phone face down and let the house breathe. Boundaries aren't rude, they're adult. A minute later, the kettle clicked off and I poured tea. In the quiet, I realized the new rule of my life. If the truth can't fit through the front door, it can wait on the lawn. An unknown number lit up my screen. You ruined my life. I could hear the theater in it. The same way teenagers slam doors to make sure you heard the slam. At 30, that shakes you. Past 40, you recognize choreography. I typed back, building mine, and hit block. I remember my grandfather telling me, after his second hip surgery, that healing requires stillness and a plan. People who break your house will try to move back in through your phone. Not today. I set a small ritual, messages after dinner only. No midnight dramatics, no answering numbers that arrive angry. I wrote the time and that text in my notebook under outside noise. When I shut the cover, I felt something click, like a bolt finding its seat. A small climax maybe, but powerful. I chose when conflict could speak to me. My phone went quiet. My home stayed a home. For the first time in days, I tasted my coffee. In the afternoon, Roger came by with a laptop bag and the patience of a man who has restored more hard drives than friendships. He didn't touch the drama. He touched the data. "They'll say you faked it," he said like a weather report. "So we make every byte provable." We exported messages with headers, verified hashes, synced system time to an atomic clock, and wrote a simple chain of custody note. Who touched what, when? Older listeners know this from tax season. Keep the receipts, label the folders, sleep better. As we worked, I felt anger cool into order. You can't argue with fire. You build a fire break. Roger left me with an external drive, a checklist, and a sentence that landed hard. Truth is boring until it saves you. After he left, I stacked the labeled envelopes like a row of small shields. The evening light fell across them. For once, the paper in my house didn't just take space. It held ground. Margaret called as the sun slid behind the maple. She spoke like a surgeon who'd seen this wound 100 times and still respected the pain. I walked her through the archive, the locks, the police visit. "We'll file emergency proceedings," she said. "Let facts, not tears, speak." It reminded me of my father quietly flooding the radiator in winter. No panic, just steps. She asked for a crisp timeline, chapel photo, text, financial moves, officer names, the hour my mother arrived with Grace and Peter. I dictated, she typed. "Good," she said at the end. "Now stop explaining online." That stung a little because part of me wanted the town square to clap, but older me knows clapping fades. Paper endures. When we hung up, I printed the timeline and slipped it into a clear sleeve. I placed it on the kitchen table where we used to eat takeout on Friday nights. Different kind of meal. Same table. This time, it fed me. By noon the next day, Jake chased attention like a dog after a mail truck. He posted that Spreadsheet Ben was choking the life out of Grace. The phrase had snap, cheap, viral. People love a neat villain. Then, like change on a metal counter, a new clip dropped. My security camera footage. Peter and Grace at my window at 3 a.m., working a garden tool under the sash. The hero story collapsed under its own weight. I didn't share it. I didn't have to. Strangers did the work, cutting their own captions. An older neighbor texted me a thumbs up, the kind of blunt support that feels like a folded lawn chair handed to you at the perfect moment. I saved the video, logged the link, and wrote one line in my notebook. Let gravity handle lies. That afternoon, the comment section turned, not in a tide, but in a series of quiet, steady ripples. Sometimes justice whispers first. I walked the lake path near my place as the air sharpened. Minnesota wind doesn't negotiate. It tells the truth. I watched a retiree toss bread to ducks and a young dad fumble with a stroller. The little ordinary scenes that make a life feel real. I thought about the night I bought this jacket, how I told myself good fabric lasts, how I wanted a long life that didn't squeak. Betrayal makes everything squeak for a while. You start hearing every hinge. As the cold moved through me, I let it. No fight, no flinch. Be honest with yourself, I said out loud, earning a funny look from a jogger. Here's the honesty. I wasn't just protecting money. I was protecting sleep. The kind of sleep where you don't rehearse defenses at 3 a.m. I got home, hung the jacket, and wrote, "Cold tells the truth, so will I." The pen dot at the end felt like a nail driven home. That evening, Eleanor, my mother, sent paragraphs about status, the way a realtor talks about curb appeal. She meant well, the way people mean well when they're afraid of noise. I read every word. She wanted peace at Thanksgiving more than she wanted justice today. I get it. Older families are museums. We curate what stays on display. But I'm not an exhibit. I wrote back, "Mom, I don't need status to breathe." Then I put the phone down and refused to watch the typing bubble. She went quiet. It hurt and helped at the same time. Healthy boundaries with your mother at 40 feel different than at 19. You learn to fold the love and the line into the same letter. I took a slow walk down the hallway, touched the fresh locks again, and reminded myself that love isn't obedience. It's honesty. The house hummed like a big appliance doing its job. I let it. I let me. Grace posted a long note about escaping financial abuse. The phrasing was clean, the kind that trends for exactly a day and then gets replaced by the next tidy outrage. My fingers wanted to run across the keyboard to anchor the narrative with 10,000 clarifications. Instead, I poured coffee, stood at the sink, and stared at the window where morning streaks always show up no matter how often you wipe. The album The Truth sat online, simple and quiet. Screenshots, statements, dates. Older me understands that if you keep talking after the record is clear, you turn facts into a debate. I refused to audition for a part in someone else's script. I did add the post to my public claims folder and logged the time. Then I closed the laptop. Some days, strength is measured in the inches between a chair and a door. I took 3 steps away and felt larger. The coffee cooled. My temper didn't. Corporate legal called with the tone of seasoned mechanics. No drama, just torque. Document everything, the counsel said. Avoid new public statements. Save it for court. I wrote the 3 directives on an index card and taped it to my monitor. Adults settle facts, not followers. A friend from my bowling league texted, "Proud of you for staying quiet." That carried more weight than 100 comments with exclamation points. I created a folder called Court Ready and began copying in the essentials: deed, bank logs, phone records, locksmith invoice, the police incident number, the chapel photo with metadata intact. I watched the progress bar creep across the screen, a slow caravan of proof migrating to a safer home. When it finished, I ejected the drive like I was closing a safe. You can't stop people from talking, but you can make sure when the door opens with your name on it, the room is ready. Late that night, I scrolled old photos, backyard cookouts, a road trip to Door County, one ski weekend where we fell more than we skied. Some smiles were real, others looked like we were auditioning for a better life. I whispered, "We were good once." Saying it didn't weaken me. It made the ground level. A man in his 50s once told me at a hardware store, "Measure twice, cut once, and don't lie to yourself about the board." I closed the gallery and looked around the room I'd just defended with paperwork and a deadbolt. "Be good to yourself," I said, and for the first time in a week, I didn't hear sarcasm in my own voice. I wrote "grieve honestly," then "build" on a sticky note and slapped it onto the fridge. We keep advice where we keep milk because both expire if you ignore them. Before bed, I checked the locks once more. They answered back with yes. At the pre-trial conference, we lined up facts like people waiting at the DMV, bored, necessary, undeniable. Margaret laid out the timeline, the chapel image, the text at 2:47 a.m., the financial siphoning hidden as groceries, the police visit, the box inventory. Opposing counsel leaned into performance, a soft-focus monologue about a mental health spiral, and mistakes made under the weight of sadness. Margaret didn't roll her eyes. She asked one question: who schedules a chapel during a crisis? The room went quiet, not dramatic, just level. Judges are older by practice, if not by age. They've heard every song. You win not with decibels, but with decimals. I placed the hard copies on the table and watched the date stamps peter the talking. Afterward, Margaret squeezed my shoulder once, a permission slip to breathe. We walked out into a hallway that smelled like floor wax and relief. The door clicked behind us like a period at the end of a sentence. The next morning, I met Roger for coffee. We spent the first 10 minutes on code, his new script for log rotation, my gripe about server alerts that cry wolf. It felt good to be ordinary, to talk about things that fail and get fixed. When we finally said the word divorce, it didn't bite as hard. "Silence is a tool," he said, stirring his cup. "Use it like a level." Older men at the counter argued about baseball stats from '87, one of them swearing he could still throw heat. It made me smile. Life runs on small debates that don't cost a soul. We paid, stepped outside, and stood in the chill, like we had in college, waiting for cheap buses to take us places we couldn't afford. "You're doing it right," he said. I didn't need a medal. That sentence was enough. Back home, I filed the receipt under ordinary days. Those are worth saving too. Jake texted that I was the dramatic one, which is something people say when their reflection starts to argue back. I asked him, "Have you ever watched your safe life catch fire from a phone screen?" The Peterts pulsed, then stopped. No answer. I put the phone down and looked out at the neighbor who walks his beagle at precisely 5 p.m. There's a comfort in routines that don't need your permission. Jake had always chased rooms that clapped. I used to follow him in there. Not anymore. I wrote, "Don't debate people who need an audience" on a card and pinned it to the corkboard. The doorbell didn't ring. The house didn't groan. Nothing exploded. That was the climax. Nothing. Sometimes the loudest victory in midlife is the crisis that fails to restart. I went back to my desk and continued labeling files. The folder tree on my screen looked like a real tree, branching, solid, alive. A few hours later, Dolores left a voicemail that tried to braid Mercy with math. "Think of her career," she said. "Think of promotions." I remembered a line from the messages they wrote. "Can't wait to see Ben's stupid face." Funny how people preach grace while budgeting cruelty. I called her back and kept it short. "Mercy belongs to the court," I said. "So, Peter, the numbers." I thanked her for calling and ended it before the conversation creased into old habits. For folks over 50, the hardest muscle to train is the one that hangs up first. I sat at the table and wrote "kind" plus "brief" plus "final" at the top of a page. Then I listed the next filings by deadline. Paper over performance. Again. Outside, a delivery truck hissed to a stop. Inside, my printer hummed. Sounds of work, not war. That's what I wanted. That's what I chose. Saturday became cleaning day, the way Saturdays used to be when money was thinner and time was longer. I pulled everything out of the hall closet: scarves we never wore, a fondue pot we never used, the emergency flashlight that still worked. I made 3 piles: keep, donate, gone. An older neighbor once told me after his divorce that healing is logistics. You decide where things live, then you live there. Every bag that left the house made the rooms breathe wider. I wiped the baseboards like a man scrubbing off a story. When I finished, I sat on the floor with a glass of water and felt something lift that wasn't dust. I labeled the shelf with painter's tape. Winter gear, tools, papers. No museum clutter, just a life I can maintain. The climax was small but real. For the first time since the text from Vegas, the house didn't feel like a witness. It felt like a partner. That evening, Eleanor knocked. Alone this time, coat buttoned to the top like armor. She doesn't apologize easily. Few strong women of her generation. Peter. She stood by the window, watched the maple shift, and said, "I was wrong." Not a speech. A turn. I told her, "Sweet. I have my blind spots too, just not the ones they posted about." We didn't hug it out like a movie. We stood in a clean kitchen and let the sentence land. She asked if I needed groceries. I laughed. First real one in a while. "I've got groceries covered," I said. We made tea and sat 15 minutes, talking about nothing heroic. Roof maintenance, her neighbor's snowblower, the thrift store that still takes corded lamps. When she left, she touched the new deadbolt and nodded as if blessing a tool. That was our truce. Mothers and sons don't always fix everything. Sometimes they agree on the lock and call it love. Emails from corporate HR rolled in like winter weather alerts, polite, precise, promising follow-up. They wanted dates, attachments, policy references. Systems of power don't shout, they document. I gathered what they requested and sent it through a clean channel. No commentary. Somewhere in an office park, a compliance team would thread this needle stitch by stitch. I didn't gloat. I've worked long enough to know that institutions move slow until they don't. And when they don't, nobody raises a voice. A friend from church texted to say he'd seen situations like this in his plant. The company always cared more about risk than gossip. He wasn't being cynical, just seasoned. I filed the sent emails and wrote, "Let the system be the system" on a fresh card. Outside, a plow rumbled past, though no snow had fallen yet. Preparation makes its own weather. I felt ready for whatever came next, not by force, but by file. Roger emailed backup scripts and showed me how to automate encrypted copies to 2 cloud locations and 1 offline drive. 3 is 2, 2 is 1, 1 is none, he joked. The old prepper line, but it fits. I labeled drives with dates, printed a contents sheet, and slid it into a folder sleeve. I even wrote plain English instructions for myself like I'd write to a future me after a long week. Older adults know this move. It's why the best garages have coffee cans full of labeled screws. When grief has a shelf, it stops spilling everywhere. I put 1 drive in a fireproof bag by the safe, 1 in my desk, 1 in a box I'd take if I ever needed to leave fast. The act did more than secure files. It secured me. My pulse slowed in measurable steps. The climax was quiet. Order layered on order until the floor held. By midweek, Jake finally met his mirror. A video surfaced of Peter sneering at him, something about his apartment smelling like cats and sadness. The comment section turned on a dime, as fickle as a March forecast. I didn't cheer. I remembered every time I'd let Jake talk me into rooms where I didn't belong. People teach you who they are. You decide how many lessons you need. An older cousin once told me, "The bill for cheap admiration comes due in embarrassment." I sent Jake a simple text, "Take care," and left it at that. No, I told you so. No lecture. The point wasn't to win him back. It was to walk myself forward. I closed the message thread like you close a drawer that won't organize itself. Then I returned to my checklist and knocked out 3 small tasks in a row. Momentum answered where applause used to. The house stayed steady. So did I. Strength didn't return like a parade. It returned like a routine. I woke, made the bed, answered emails, walked the block, and handled what was in front of me. Not heroic. Adult. I stopped chasing what was leaving, and it stopped dragging me. In the mirror, I looked less like a man waiting to be chosen and more like a man who chooses. Court was next, and strangely, I wasn't afraid. Reflection without fear. That felt new at my age. I ironed a shirt, packed the binder, and tucked a square of paper in the front pocket with 3 lines. Breathe. Tell the truth. Let the process work. On my way out, I paused at the door and touched the lock I'd installed before dawn days ago. It clicked once. Clean. That small sound had become my anthem. I stepped onto the porch and into the chill, not hunting for victory music, just ready. The war had taught me maintenance. Maintenance would carry me through. Court morning came in the color of an old photograph. Flat gray, quiet, unforgiving. I carried my binder like a lunch pail, something solid in a place that feeds on nerves. Grace and Thomas Peter looked drained, eyes ringed with the kind of tired you can't nap away. I sat where Margaret told me to sit, front left, clear view of the bench. The clerk's voice rolled through the room, a reminder that this wasn't a TV show. It was a building where paper is king. I laid my documents out edge to edge, squared the corners, and let my pulse slow until it matched the wall clock. When the judge entered, we stood. I didn't pray for lightning. I prayed for sequence. Facts first, feelings second. It's a small prayer a lot of older men make. Keep the order, and I can keep myself. The gavel tapped once, precise as a metronome. I knew then I was ready to be measured. Their lawyer went first with the soft focus story, tragic comfort, gray areas, mental fog. It was a lullaby aimed at adults who've lived too long to believe in lullabies. Margaret didn't match tone. She changed the channel. She slid photos to the clerk, held up receipts, read messages line by line. Emotion has a place in marriage. Evidence has a podium in court. I watched the judge's pen move, not fast but steadily, the way you sign checks you intend to cash. A man my father's age once told me, if you can't lift it with numbers, don't try to lift it. Margaret lifted. Each exhibit found its number. The other side tried to interrupt. The bench raised a hand and the room fell back into order. My fingers unclenched around my pen. We weren't selling a feeling. We were laying a floor. You could almost hear the nails bite wood. That was the first victory. We were standing on something level. Then Judge Alani asked the question that found the bottom of the lake. In what context is "can't wait to see Ben's stupid face" a joke? The sentence sat in the air like a heavy tool. Useful, unavoidable. Silence followed. Not awkward, just instructive. Lawyers glance at notes when they wish they could glance at a better client. No one spoke. I felt the room change temperature by a degree or two, the way a kitchen does when you open the oven and realize the roast is patterny or ruined. In that silence, I thought of small humiliations I'd swallowed to keep the peace. Late arrivals, whispered excuses, laughs that didn't fit my mouth. Older couples will know this. You trade pennies of pride to buy peterlers of quiet. The judge weighted the exact right number of beats and wrote something down. The sound of the pen was my favorite sound so far. The stone had hit water. You could see the rings. We presented the line from chapel to courtroom, the photo under neon, the text at 2:47 a.m., the premarital deed to my house, the withdrawals hidden under groceries, the police report number, the box inventory, the chain of custody. It read less like a play and more like an owner's manual. Margaret kept her voice even, the way you speak when you trust your tools. I handed up a clean copy of the deed. The opposing counsel frowned like paper had personally offended him. I don't blame him. Paper is stubborn. It doesn't care about charisma. Somewhere in my head, I heard my dad saying, "Write it down or it didn't happen." We wrote it down. The judge followed the breadcrumbs without once asking where the forest went. When we finished, Margaret capped her pen and nodded as if to say, "That's the house. That's the wiring." The clerk stamped a sheet, and the thud sounded like a door settling tight. Mr. Henderson testified in 3 crisp minutes. He confirmed my performance reviews, the paid leave, and the phone call from Peter's father that slid off him like rain off a good coat. "We don't discipline on whispers," he said. "We require documentation." It wasn't heroic. It was adult. Dignity doesn't need a lobbyist. The older you get, the more you respect quiet competence. The mechanic who fixes the rattle without bragging. The nurse who tapes the IV without fuss. The courtroom absorbed that tone. Opposing counsel tried to turn it into a conspiracy. The judge's eyebrow dismissed the idea before Margaret needed to. Henderson stepped down, and I felt something uncoil in my chest. Work, at its best, is a place where you are what you do, not what someone says about you. In a story full of performances, his testimony was a ledger entry, neat, dated, paid. The gavel tapped once for a recess. Even the bench needed a breath. Back in session, Dolores clung to the way people grip a stair rail after a slip. She spoke about reputations and expectations, about futures planned like centerpieces. Law deals in paper, not wishes. Margaret's reply was a single sentence. "Truth isn't a popularity vote." I looked down at my palms. Same lines I've had since high school, new meaning written between them. Older adults know this feeling. Your hands stay the same while your life changes shape around them. The judge didn't scold Peter Lores. She simply returned us to exhibits and dates. The furniture of the room. I could feel the gallery lean away from the theater and toward the ledger. Even the air sounded different. Less shuffle, more listening. When Dolores finished, her voice trailed into the kind of quiet that keeps its dignity. The judge thanked her. That mattered to me. Even when we miss the truth, we deserve steadiness. The court gave it. The record held it. The ruling arrived like a well-folded letter. Clear lines. Proper margins. Every page where it belonged. Exclusive use of my home. Premarital property. Accounts untouched. Divorce granted on adultery and fraud. The clerk read in a steady cadence that reminded me of church bulletins and weather updates. Calm, final. Grace would take her personal belongings and the leased SUV, payments attached like a tail she now had to pull. No fireworks, no cruel flourish, just order. I felt the tightness in my jaw let go by inches, the way a stubborn jar finally yields. Across the aisle, Grace stared at the table. Peter studied the floor as if it offered a hatch. You don't get a hatch in rooms like this. You get a record. The gavel landed once. That was it. People imagine victory as noise. In middle age, it often sounds like paper sliding into a file. The judge moved on to the next matter. Our storm had passed. Then came the line that put the scales on a mark. During her certification, Judge Alani said she benefited from his income. Rehabilitative alimony, 500 peterlars per month, 1 year. Not a fortune. Not meant to be. Precision matters to grown people in grown rooms. It wasn't punishment. It was proportion. I remembered cutting a board with my father and him saying, "Leave it proud and sand it down." The court left it proud enough to be seen, small enough to be fair. The opposing table shifted, recalculating their exit strategies. Margaret wrote the figure on my copy and underlined it once. "We're patern here," she whispered, which was the best sentence I'd heard all month. I exhaled a breath I'd been holding since Vegas. You don't know how heavy waiting is until it steps off your shoulders. We stood. I gathered my binder like a lunch pail again and followed her into the hall where the light felt cleaner. Outside, voices rose and bounced around the marble like kids on a gym floor. Eleanor stood beside me, not with speeches, just with presence. You can build a bridge out of that at 50, out of someone choosing to be physically near when it's messy. She didn't say, "I told you so," or "let it go." She said, "Hungry?" And I realized I was. We found a bench, and I ate a granola bar I'd tossed in my pocket that morning. It tasted better than most restaurant bread. Across the hall, people filmed themselves for relatives who would never watch the clips. Security eyed the herd, ready to turn noise back into hallway. I checked my watch, a habit from years of making meetings in half hour. The worst thing was over. Not everything, just the worst thing. That's a kind of climax you appreciate in midlife. Not the parade, the pause, the quiet that comes back and stays. When Grace vanished from the scrum, Dolores spun toward Peter like a weather vane in a gust. "Texting that bartender again," she snapped. And there it was, the crack that travels faster than sound. His forehead folded, the nice mask slipped. I've seen that look in a lot of men when the room stops agreeing with them. Daylight treats carefully curated images like sun treats thin ice. You hear the groan, then the break. He looked around for the old deference and found only tiles and a camera lens. If you've lived long enough, you've seen a moment like this at a family reunion or company party. The second the story stops working, I didn't gloat. I buttoned my coat. The hallway smelled like floor wax and relief, and I preferred one over the other. Margaret tapped her watch. Time to sign. We moved on while his face tried to decide between anger and collapse. Daylight chose for him. Jake tried to offer a hand the way men Peter when they hope the right gesture can rewind bad tape. Peter sneered, called his apartment Cats and Sadness, loud enough to make people wince. Jake's face closed like a door that's learned its lesson. He walked away without a speech, an ending I respect. Some friendships don't dissolve in shouting. They crystallize in a single sentence, too true to ignore. I thought about every room Jake pulled me into because applause lived there. I used to need that noise. Now I prefer the click of a lock I chose. The officer at the far end of the hall shifted his stance, the universal sign that playtime is over. Margaret led me to a conference room with a window that looked onto a square of sky. I took one slow breath. The air tasted like the first day after a cold. Not spring yet, but you can feel it coming. In the conference room, Margaret slid a thin stack across the table. "Closure papers," she said. I signed where the yellow flags told me to sign. She slipped the documents into a folder and, with a grin small enough to be professional, pointed to the framed copy of the Vegas marriage certificate on her shelf. I like trophies of justice. I didn't quite smile, but the corners of me lifted. Lawyers get accused of loving drama. The good ones love structure. We reviewed next steps. Mail arrives, we respond. Calls come, we log. "You did the hard part," she said, and there was no music cue, just a pen clicking shut. I shook her hand and meant it. Outside the window, a city kept moving. Deliveries, lunch breaks, someone arguing with a meter. I tucked the folder into my bag like it contained directions home. In a way, it did. Paper again, doing what speeches can't. Weeks turned, and so did the weather. Rumors reversed course like a river freed of a dam. Grace lost her job quietly. Peter went under ethics review. Nobody sent me press releases. They didn't have to. The restaurants that once greeted them by name now found their reservation unavailable. Silence is the loudest sentence a city can pass. I swept my porch, a chore my father used to call thinking with a broom. Neighbors waved from driveways. A few said they were sorry in the plain way people over 40 prefer. No slogans, just eye contact. I nodded. I wasn't keeping score, I was keeping pace. The maple out front dropped the last of its leaves, and the street crew came through with the big vacuum truck, a machine that sounds like it's erasing mistakes. You wish it could. It can't. But it can make a clean slate for winter. That's enough for most of us. It was enough for me. I sold the old house. Too many echoes live in wood grain. I bought a bright Con Peter in the Arts District, half the size, twice the light, a yellow sofa that makes even cloudy afternoons feel like noon. Plants that forgive you when you forget to water them once. I stood in the middle of the empty living room on move-in day and let the quiet introduce itself. The place smelled like new paint and patience. A neighbor in his 60s held the door for me with the grace of a man who's moved more than once. "Welcome," he said, and that was that. I arranged the desk by a window, set the fireproof bag in the closet, and pressed my palm to the wall like a blessing. The climax wasn't fireworks. It was a key in a different lock turning smooth. I slept that night without rehearsing arguments. I woke up hungry for breakfast instead of proof. Progress can be that simple. Saturday, I tried a spin class because the Con Peter gym offered one free. That's where I met Nina. Terrible puns, perfect coffee recommendations, a smile that looked like something she actually wears, not something she rents for photos. We cooled down by the water fountain and swapped stories about misfit furniture and broken toasters. On our third date, I told her everything. I didn't rush or dramatize. I let the timeline carry it. She listened without touching her phone. When I finished, she said, "You're tougher than a dollar steak," and laughed at her own line. I laughed too, from a place below the ribs that hadn't made a sound in months. Dating after 40 is less about spark and more about stamina. Can we tell the truth and still want to go for a walk? We did. On the way home, I realized I wasn't editing myself for approval. That felt like the beginning of something that doesn't need a caption. I met Margaret again to update my will, a chore that belongs in the same drawer as changing furnace filters and checking smoke alarms. We sat in her office while a paralegal shuffled forms with the competence of a pit crew. Margaret pointed at the framed Vegas license and shook her head, amused. "Souvenir of justice," she said. I signed where she pointed. We talked about beneficiaries, the Con Peter, the small fund I'll leave to a scholarship in my father's name. No drama, just grown-up chores that make grief easier for the people who love you. On my way out, she handed me a thin envelope and said, "You earned your ordinary life back." The elevator ride down felt like the reverse of a bad dream, floors counting you toward daylight. Outside, I tucked the envelope into my bag and checked the sky. It was the kind of blue that doesn't brag. That's my favorite kind now. Late one night, a message blinked from a number I didn't recognize. "You destroyed me." It's strange how people who swing the hammer insist you broke the glass. I typed back, "Reclaim me," and pressed the block. Free Peter sometimes takes one tap. I put the phone face down and walked to the window. The city hummed in that steady way older adults love. Garbage trucks at the right time, buses sighing at the right corners. I made oatmeal like my grandfather used to. Milk first, pinch of salt, let it sit. I ate it standing up and decided that was an acceptable form of celebration at my age. The climax wasn't the message. It was the boundary that followed it. I slept without dreams worth remembering. In the morning, the blocked number meant nothing, which is exactly what it deserved. There's dignity in ordinary breakfast after a season of alarms. A week later, in the courthouse lot where stories often end and sometimes begin again, Thomas Peter waited by a concrete planter. He looked smaller without the stage lights, eyes hollow, posture half-folded. He held out his phone. Wire transfer, $100,000. For old times, he said, "Brotherhood ends here." There was a version of me that might have said something cutting, something that would earn claps in certain rooms. I nodded instead. No handshake. That money wasn't mercy. It was a receipt. He turned away first. The air smelled like rain on hot pavement, a clean, temporary thing. I screenshot the confirmation when it arrived and filed it under finals, not because I needed the cash to breathe, but because closure deserves a line item. As I drove off, the radio played a song I didn't know. I let it play anyway. Some endings don't need your soundtrack. They just need your exit. Back home, I unlocked the door that answers me, cracked the window, and let the leaves rustle like applause no one controls. Justice doesn't erase pain. It balances it, like a scale that finally stops wobbling. When the weight evens out, breathing becomes simple again. I walked through the computer, touched the spines of a few books, watered the plants that forgive me, and sat on the yellow sofa that turns afternoons into bright rooms. I thought about the men I know, divorced, widowed, still married, who keep going by keeping order. It isn't glamorous. It works. I sent a thank you text to Roger and Margaret and then closed the laptop on a clean desktop. The climax, if there was one, came in the quiet. The sense that my life fits in my hands again. Not the life I planned, but the life I can maintain. I took one long breath and let it all the way out. Then I started dinner. I don't live in that Tuesday anymore. The wound is a scar now. Proof of survival, not a story I owe anyone. I chose order over chaos that night. Locks over shouting. Paper over posts. Truth over charm. Myself over illusion. Since then, mornings arrive clean. The maple still burns red in October. I simply see it sooner. I make tea, check the deadbolt once, and get on with the work of a life that fits. The house I lost became light I kept. The friends I shed made room for the few who show up without cameras. Even the wire from Peter is filed where it belongs. One more receipt that says closure paid. I didn't get the life I planned. And that's fine. I got the one I can maintain. The one with quiet competence and open windows. If a message ever detonates your world, answer cool, close the valves, guard your perimeter, and start building toward daylight. It comes.